So let me briefly begin this class by explaining to you what phenomenology is and how it works. So phenomenology is a branch of philosophy that investigates human experience by turning its attention to the way objects and things appear to us in consciousness. So rather than starting with abstract theories or external theories, phenomenology seeks and wants to go back to the thing themselves, meaning with this formula, very famous formula, that phenomenology wants to examine our lived and immediate experience and uncover the structures of meaning that are part of it. So it wants to uncover the structures that make our life meaningful. This means that phenomenology does not gives us experience as something neutral, but it gives us experience as something deeply personal and situated. Indeed, it emphasizes the first person perspective, being aware and recognizing that each individual lives through experience in a very personal and unique way, a way that is shaped by memory, by culture, by our personal history, by our body, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a very fundamental insight of phenomenology. So let me be clear about this by making an example that it's a very simple example that probably will help you better understand what I mean with this brief description of what phenomenology does. Now, let's try to imagine two little children that are riding a bike for the first time. That's a very simple example, as you can see. So the first child grew up in a very busy and chaotic city, a very big, busy, chaotic city, and so they have always been afraid of traffic because they know how risky traffic is. When they learned to ride a bike, and subsequently when they were riding a bike, they always felt very nervous. They always have to be hyper aware of all of the cars around them. And also they experienced a sense of vulnerability, of a fragility, because the activity of riding a bike was actually something risky. On the other hand, the second child grew up in the countryside, and for them, the experience and the activity of riding a bike had a completely different meaning, because instead of being connected with the feeling of anxiety and the feeling of vulnerability, it was actually connected with freedom and adventure, with the possibility of discovering the world. So for this second child, riding a bike brought not anxiety, but joy, relaxation, even a deep connection with nature. You can see through this example that phenomenology is not interested in how a bike is constructed. It's not interested in the physics of riding a bike. It's not interested in how many people are riding a bike instead of taking the bus or driving a car. Phenomenology is interested in how each person experiences a certain activity. In this case, riding a bike. Phenomenology is interested in how each person lives through a particular activity, a particular moment. And so phenomenology wants to understand all of the feelings, the emotions, the thoughts, the memories, and the perceptions that people have during a certain moment, a certain experience. So phenomenology asks questions like, for instance, what it is like from the inside, from my consciousness, from my inside, to ride a bike, to do a certain activity, or how do fears, expectations, how does my cultural background shape the experience that or the meaning of certain experiences or certain activities. Now, you can really see here how the subjective experience is fundamental, is pivotal, is this all of the center of phenomenology, is what phenomenology revolves around, because it doesn't care about what happened, but how I felt during a certain experience and what it meant for me, that particular experience. So to really summarize what I have been said, phenomenology is interested in exploring the differences in experience and in trying to uncover the structures of perception, of intention, and of meaning making that guide our life, our human life. Needless to say, by conceiving and interpreting experience as something deeply subjective and personal and situated, phenomenology allows us and opens up a richer understanding of human experience and human existence. An understanding that recognizes how experience and existence is not something neutral, but it's actually an active engagement with the surrounding environment. Okay, now let me introduce to you now what the history of phenomenology is, because yes, we said that lived experience is the core of phenomenology. It is something that distinguishes and defines phenomenology in its essence. But before analyzing and moving on to the analysis of the phenomena of the body and the gaze, which are two central topics of phenomenology and which present some striking connections, implications with the practice of visual thinking, I would really like to sketch a brief history of phenomenology, of the phenomenological method. It must be said that phenomenology has a quite short history compared to the one of philosophy, because phenomenology was first systematized by Edmund Husserl, a German philosopher, during the early 20th century. Husserl tried to establish a rigorous science of consciousness. So he wanted to ground a new science that had as its object consciousness, that wanted to delve deep into consciousness. And Edmund Husserl emphasized the necessity of going back to the thing themselves, which, as we already know, means that he wanted philosophy to focus on objects, on events, on experiences as they presented themselves to consciousness, to us in consciousness, without imposing any sort of theories or assumptions to these objects, events, and experiences. In his work, he introduced some key concepts, some fundamental concepts, such as those of intentionality, which for Husserl describes the nature of consciousness, and the epoche, which is the starting point of the phenomenological analysis and inquiry. Now, let me pause for 2 seconds on these two concepts and explain to you a little bit more in details what intentionality and the epoche is, because these two concepts are going to be fundamental for the whole history of phenomenology, and they're also going to have some great connections with visual thinking. So let's start with intentionality. What is intentionality? Husserl says that intentionality describes the nature of consciousness, because consciousness is always directed towards something. Consciousness always has an object. And this means that our thoughts, our emotions, our memories, and our perceptions are never empty. They always have a target point. They always have a reference point. They always have an object. This is the meaning of intentionality. In other words, every intentional act of consciousness has an intentional object. Now, we can make examples in order to explain such a concept of intentionality, but I think it's very easy to understand. But let's pretend that we are in a park and we're walking around the park. At a certain time, we stop because we see a tree that we like. Now, the intentional act of seeing a tree has an object, the tree that is in front of me. When I see I see. I never simply see. I always see something. In this case, I'm walking around a park, so I see a tree. This intentional act has an object, a specific object. But we can also make another example, the example of, for instance, missing a friend. When I miss a friend, my consciousness is directed toward that particular friend that I miss, even though that friend is absent. Of course, is absent, otherwise I wouldn't be missing that friend. But the intentional act of missing something or something, in this case, again, is not a sheer act of missing, a pure and general act of missing. It's always the act of missing something, and thus it involves the emotion of longing for a person and the object that refers to that longing, in this case the friend. So you see here that intentionality is really, really important, because it highlights how consciousness is not a sealed off mental container, but it's always directed towards something. It always has a point of reference. It always goes beyond itself. Now, what about the epoche? We're still missing the epoche. What is the epoche? The epoche is a Greek word that literally means suspension of judgments. And for Husserl, the epoche is the starting point of the phenomenological analysis and inquiry, because the epoche signals and identifies a process through which the researcher sets aside, or even brackets all of the preconceptions, the prejudices, the assumptions, the preconceived notions, the judgments that they have, in order to fully attend phenomena as they appear to their consciousness. So the researcher suspend their beliefs about the world in order to go back to the world in its essence. Again, here, I think I found a really great example, because we might think that this attitude of the epoche is something weird, something that we do not practice in real life. But actually, the attitude of the epoche is something really concrete that we can see on a daily basis. And my example has to do with movies. So when you watch a movie, during the 2 hours that the movie lasts, you bracket the question. You don't ask yourself whether the characters of the movie are real or not, they exist or not. You just bracket this problem. You set aside this specific problem. Instead, you focus on the story. You focus on the images that are conveyed to you. You focus on the feelings and emotions that the story transmits to you. Similarly, during the epoche, you are bracketing all of your judgments, your preconceptions, your prejudices, etc., in order to focus and immerse yourself in what you are experiencing. So that's the fundamental idea of the epoche, and you can see that it's quite a common thing to do in real life. It happens in real life, but we have to make it something more systematized, something more organized, and that's what phenomenology and visual thinking are trying to do. Now, from Husserl's project, phenomenology has branched into diverse traditions. The first important shift came with Martin Heidegger, who was a Husserl student and a one-time assistant. We know that for Husserl, the center around which phenomenology revolves is consciousness. So for Husserl, phenomenology is the science of consciousness. Heidegger, on the other hand, turned phenomenology into the study of being itself. So he changed the topic and the object of phenomenology. But this is very complicated. What interests us is simply the fact that Heidegger had the insight of conceiving the subjects, the subjects that inhabit the world, not as a detached subjects that are simply contemplating the object that surrounds them, but as being in the world. That is, Heidegger understands consciousness and understands subjects as being in the world. And that means for him that subjects are not constituted by detached relations, but are actually constituted by their practical involvement with the world. That is, by using tools, by using objects, by manipulating objects, by carrying out their projects, their desires, their volitions, or their intentions, and by engaging with others, by caring about others. Another author, another phenomenologist who tried to enrich the phenomenology was Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Maurice Merleau-Ponty was a French philosopher who tried to establish a radical philosophy of perception and embodiment. And he did so in the phenomenology of perception. Here, he tried to reconceive perception, what perception is and how it functions, defining perception not as a matter of a disembodied subject receiving neutral data from the outside, but he tried to conceive perception as a matter of an embodied consciousness interacting with the world, engaging with the environment, and thus creating meaningful ideas and, in general, meanings within the world to apply to the world. Merleau-Ponty also criticized the Cartesian tradition for treating the body as a mere physical object among other objects. Because the Cartesian, and he also criticized the Cartesian tradition for thinking that consciousness was completely separated from the body itself and could control and command the body. Instead of viewing the body and consciousness in this way, Merleau-Ponty argued that the body is the primary site of knowing the world. The body thus is sort of like the medium through which we can access the world. And he called this understanding of the body as lived body. So you see here the opposition between the material physical body, which was the body as conceived by Descartes, and the lived body as this primary site of knowing the world, which is the body as conceived by Merleau-Ponty. But we will go back to this problem of the duality of the body. Now, Merleau-Ponty's emphasis on embodiment has had profound implications for psychology, art, and cognitive science, but it has also been a very powerful resource for starting to address the social and political dimension of embodiment. And indeed, Merleau-Ponty was used as a source of inspiration from Simone de Beauvoir and Frantz Fanon. These are two radical thinkers who tried to connect embodiment, the problem of embodiment, with a racist and patriarchal society. So, for instance, Simone de Beauvoir used Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological insights to analyze how women live in a patriarchal society. Similarly, Frantz Fanon used Merleau-Ponty insights to describe the lived experience of racial oppression and colonialism, highlighting how colonial power and racism shape the very structures of perception, embodiment, and self-consciousness. As I've already pointed out to you a couple minutes ago, one of the most profound and enduring contribution of phenomenology lies in its rethinking of the body. Rather than treating the body as a mere biological or material object among other objects, phenomenology illuminates the body as the very medium through which we can access the world, but also we can disclose the world, or the world is better disclosed to us. Thus, the fundamental idea of phenomenology is that the body is not simply something that we have, but also something that we are. Now, this is something very fundamental to phenomenology, and to better comprehend this very peculiar structure of the body, for which the body is something that we have and something that we are, but most fundamentally something that we are, not something that we have, phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty used a very powerful image, and this is the image of touching and being touched. Indeed, in the experience of one hand touching the other hand, something very unique happens. The one hand is both subject, the toucher, and object, the touched. Let me explain this to you by quoting Merleau-Ponty, because I think this quote is really, really clear and understandable. So I start the quote. When my right hand touches my left hand, I am aware of my left hand as a tactile thing, as an object that is being touched by the right hand, which is, in this case, the subject. But at the same time, if I wish, my left hand can also touch my right hand, so that I feel myself touched as well as touching. End of quotation. You see here that there is a paradox that concerns the body, because the body has a very unique status compared to other objects. Unlike external objects, the body is simultaneously subjectivity and objectivity, subject and object. It is both lived and material. The touched experience discloses the body really has a hinge between the subject and the world, between the self and other, and thus it allows to collapse, to make the Cartesian dualism collapse. Now, the first phenomenologist who actually posed this distinction, this very pivotal distinction between the lived body and the material body, was actually Husserl, which we already know. In Ideas 2, indeed, Husserl drew this crucial distinction, naming the material body Körper and the lived body Leib, and describing the lived body as the 0 point of orientation through which time, space, and objects are given to me as a subject. Let me make very clear, very simply, an example. So I can experience and I can distinguish left and right, sorry, and left, up and down, near or far, only through my body's positionality. It is my body place in space that allows me to say that something is left, something is right, something is up or down, near or far. It is only through the body's positionality. Thus, our lived body is not simply located in space, but it organizes space. It gives a meaning to objects in space. And this also means that the body is not simply an instrument in the hands of consciousness, but the body is actually the very condition of my experiences, the very conditions of what I live through. Now, Merleau-Ponty tried to enrich and radicalize this distinction between the lived body and the material body. In other words, he tried to radicalize this insight that Husserl had. And he did so in the phenomenology of perception, as you already know. Foregrounding the body as the central locus of experience and perception. Now, as you might expect, for Merleau-Ponty as well, the body should not be conceived as an assemblage of mechanisms. That is, it should not be conceived as a mechanical structure that follows the command of consciousness. Rather, the body is an expressive and intentional structures that, again, allows us to access the world, allows us to give meanings to the world, to create meanings for the world. And here, I'm going to be a little bit repetitive because you can see that we're still talking about the distinction between the lived body and the material body. But Merleau-Ponty also says that while the material body, the biological body, can be treated physiologically, can be measured scientifically, can be manipulated as an object. The lived body cannot be treated as such. The lived body has a qualitative difference from the material body. And you see here that the lived body is something that is the body as it is experienced by the subject. So it's completely different from the material body. Merleau-Ponty insists on multiple occasions that the lived body cannot be reduced to the biological body. They are qualitatively different. But the problem remains, or a question remains: why can't the lived body be reduced to the biological body? Why can't we make this reduction? Why does the lived body always exceed the biological body? In order to explain to you the reason why we have this sort of like separation for two different type of bodies, I have an example for you that I'm going to read, and that's the example of vision, of what it means to see. Now, physiology can easily outline the mechanisms of vision, describing how light strikes the retina, how the optic nerve transmits signals, and how the brain processes visual stimuli. Yet, by giving such a description, physiology cannot fully capture what it is like to see, a quality that belongs to the realm of lived and situated experience rather than objective description. Thus, a scientific explanation gives us the eye as an object. It gives us the eyes as an optical system ready to be investigated. But phenomenology gives us vision as a lived phenomenon. It gives us vision as color being a shimmer, depth being an openness into the world, form being an appearance. You see here the difference there is between the two understanding of the lived body and the material body. And again, let me read Merleau-Ponty. The body is not an object in the world, but our means of communicating with the world, a system of possible actions, a virtual body with its phenomenon place defined by its task and situation. End of quotation. According to Merleau-Ponty, this distinction between the lived body and the biological body, but also this irreducibility of the lived body with the biological body, becomes all the more clear thanks to cases of illness and disability. So I would like to cite to you two examples of illness and disability that illuminate this distinction. First of all, I'm going to talk about very briefly the experience of a person suffering from a paralysis. So a person who has suffered from a paralysis may have an intact biological body, but their lived body is completely altered because the way this person can access the world is completely different from the way this person accessed the world before the paralysis. Think about a person who's moving in a room, moving their legs, and a person who is in a wheelchair. They have a completely different access to the world, and they have completely different possibilities. And so the lived body, the lived experience that is made possible through the lived body is completely different. Conversely, in phantom limb phenomena, an amputee might still feel sensations like pain or itch in a missing limb. In case you don't know, the phenomenon of the phantom limb describes or occurs when an amputee continues to feel different kind of sensations, as I told you, like pain, itching, movement, for instance, in a limb that is no longer physically present. Here you can see that the body is lived because it possesses a certain kind of memory, a memory of what it felt like to move and access the world through a limb that is not there anymore. It can be an arm, it can be a leg, it can be a different it can be whatever. But the idea is that, the fundamental idea is that the body has a memory, and so it applies as such a memory to the missing arm, to the missing part. Now, Merleau-Ponty concludes from these examples that the body, as we know, is not something passive, it's something alive, and it constitutes the horizon of our experience. It is really important to stress at this point another notion that Merleau-Ponty introduces, which is really, really important, because when we realize that the body is something lived, the body is a lived body, not just a physical or material body, we also realize that the body possesses a kind of intentionality. As much as consciousness possesses a kind of intentionality. But the way the intentionality of the body works is completely different from the way the intentionality of consciousness works. And as you already know, I like examples. So I'm gonna read the description of two different examples that I made in order to explain to you this pivotal concept of bodily intentionality, of the intentionality of the body. So first example, when a person reaches for a cup of tea, they do not pause to measure spatial distances, compute trajectories, or consciously issue commands to their muscles. This knowledge is not intellectual. Sorry, I skipped a line. Instead, their body moves fluidly, as if the hand already knows the cup's location. This knowledge is not intellectual or abstract, but practical and embodied. It arises from the body schema, the tacit sense of one's bodily capacities in relation to the surrounding world. And that's the first example, not reaching for a cup of tea, in this case water, in order to drink. The second example, it concerns a pianist. Similarly, so I'm going to start, when a pianist performs a song, they do not consciously instruct each finger to move in precise sequences. If they tried to, the performance would be stiff and unplayable. Instead, years of practice sediment into the body so that the music flows through them without explicit calculation. The pianist's hand find the keys, and the fingers move in a continuous rhythm that is guided by bodily intentionality. You see here that through these very, I think, clear examples, we can understand how the movements of the bodies are not mechanical or reflexive movements that simply respond to the command of consciousness. Rather, the movements of the body are intrinsically connected with a form of intentionality that the body has. And this form of intentionality is called by Merleau-Ponty motor intentionality, because it's a pre-reflexive type of intentionality. The body is directed toward the world. It has the world, the objects of the world, as its point of reference, as its target. But the way the body moves and creates meaning through its movement is not reflexive, but pre-reflexive. And Merleau-Ponty says something very interesting because for him, the intentionality of the body actually precedes the intentionality of consciousness. And he writes that consciousness is not in the first place a matter of I think that, but of I can. So the most original form of intentionality is bodily intentionality, motor intentionality, and it is the intentionality of what I can and cannot do through my body as the medium to access the world. Yet, Merleau-Ponty not only examines the body and the role of the body in individual experience, he also highlights the importance of the body in order to encounter and understand the perspective of others. So for him, the body does not only have a role in our personal experience, but also in an intersubjective experience that allows us to connect with other people. Indeed, he argues that when we encounter others, we do so through our body. We do so through bodily expressions and bodily gestures. For instance, a smile, a tear, a movement with our hand, a posture, and so on and so forth. Now, a smile, a tear, a gesture, or a posture, they are immediately experienced as a form of emotion, as a form of idea. Okay, so for instance, I see a person smiling, and I immediately feel happiness because I immediately feel like that person is happy. Or I see a person crying, I see a tear on a friend's face, on my friend's face, and I immediately experience sadness because I connect that tear with sadness. Now, you see here that bodily expressions and inner meaning are inseparable. But the key point is that bodily expressions, bodily gestures allow us to encounter other people, allow us to understand what other people are feeling and are going through. To highlight the central role, the fundamental role that the body plays in connecting with other people, Merleau-Ponty coined the notion of intercorporeality. Usually we hear the notion of intersubjectivity. Well, Merleau-Ponty substituted the concept of intersubjectivity with the concept of intercorporeality to highlight the fundamental role of the body and bodily gestures, and to show us that our own bodies are actually intertwined with the bodies of other people. Before I conclude, I just want to say one simple thing about this experience of intercorporeality, that as much as the body is pre-reflexive, so is the intercorporeal understanding of others pre-reflexive. So we perceive the intentionality of others through their bodies, not through a type of reasoning, not through a chain of ideas, concepts, and reasoning. So in this case, it is our embodied nature, it is embodiment that grounds our interaction, our intertwinement with other people. And you see how this idea really has fundamental implications for psychology, neuroscience, communication studies, and so on and so forth. As we have seen, phenomenology, with its emphasis on lived experience and situated experience, offers us a very unique and nuanced framework for analyzing the body. But this same analysis, this same unique and nuanced framework can be applied to the examination of the different perceiving acts of the body. And among these perceiving acts, one of the most important is certainly the seemingly simple act of gazing, of seeing something, which both involves seeing something and being seen by someone. According to phenomenology, indeed, the gaze plays a critical role in shaping embodiment, self-consciousness, and our own intentions. And while traditional empirical approaches treat the gaze, as we have seen with physiology, as a mechanical process, as something simply mechanical that can be completely explained by a scientific understanding of that phenomenon, the phenomenological method reveals the gaze not merely as the act of looking at something, but as an active engagement with the world in a meaningful, intentional, and structured way. The gaze that is directed toward something is a sustained and charged relationship with objects, with the world, with the surrounding environment, and it discloses to us new aspects of the object that is being seen, new aspects of the world in general, a new aspect also of the subject who is doing the seeing. So you see here that there is really a complex structure that is involved within the seemingly simple act of seeing. And again, really, the gaze is not something simple. It's something very articulated, very complex, and it's never something neutral. It's a charged, structured relationship between the self and the other, between the subject and the world, which transform the way in which we live, which transforms how it feels to live, to experience the world that surrounds us. Now, the first thing that we must highlight when talking about the phenomenological understanding of the gaze is that for phenomenology, the gaze is never something passive. To look at something is not a passive or neutral activity. It's actually something very active, very imbued with meaning, because to gaze at something is to pay attention, is to linger at something, is to highlight one aspect of an experience while letting others fade away into the background. In this sense, the gaze is a very creative operation that selects, that interprets, and produces meaning. For instance, here we can make another of the many examples that I like to make, and we can transfer ourselves to a museum. So we can go to a museum, and when we are in a museum, we usually look at paintings or sculptures or sketches, or other things, other objects, other types of objects. It depends what museum we are in. But let's pretend that we're looking at a painting. When I look at a painting in a museum, I'm not just registering shapes, forms, and colors. I am actively organizing what I see into patterns. I am sensing emotions. I am remembering things. I am recalling memories. And I'm also actively connecting what I see with something that I already know. So I'm making new, different connections. My gaze then transforms the arrangements of pigment that I see into the canvas into something new, into a new image that speaks to me, that tells me something, whether this is beauty, unease, sorrow, joy, and so on and so forth. However, it is important to understand that when we look at something, when we look at a painting, we are not trying to extrapolate a meaning that is already there. So we're not trying to recognize the meaning that lies between the painting in order to register that meaning. Now we're doing something completely different. We are creating a meaning, a subjective meaning, by looking at the painting. There is no prefixed or original meaning that we have to discover. We simply have to create our own personal and subjective meaning, which is created by the act of looking at the painting. Okay. This idea or this understanding of what to look at something is implies that the painting on the wall is not a simple object on the wall, hanging on the wall, but it's actually a presence that draws the viewer's attention, that reshapes the viewer's awareness, that creates a dissolution of boundaries between the viewer and the object, between the viewer who's watching the painting and the painting itself. Now, this idea is really, really important. This idea for which to gaze at something is an intrinsically active activity or intrinsically active movement or perception is really, really pivotal, is really, really central, because it has very important implications for the practice of visual thinking, for a deeper understanding of the practice of visual thinking. So I want to stop here for a second, and I want to, again, make an example. No, it's not really an example. I want to describe to you a painting, what I see when I look at a particular painting, which is my favorite painting, and I'm talking about the Starry Night of Van Gogh. I made a description of what I see when I look at that painting, and so I'm going to read to you this description, and then I'm going to continue to reflect upon this idea that looking at something is something intrinsically active and creative. So let me begin. When I look at the Starry Night, Van Gogh's Starry Night, I am struck by the tension between tranquility and turbulence. The small, sleeping village feels almost unaware of the vast, restless energy unfolding above it. The swirly heavens suggest both beauty and chaos, as if the cosmos is alive and overflowing with intensity. The cypress tree, stretching like a dark flame, feels almost like a human gesture, a yearning to connect with something that is beyond. I notice how the painting resists a passive glance. The brush strokes compel the eye to follow their paths, pulling me into the sky's motion. My attention oscillates between the grounded, structured geometry of the village and the infinite, unbounded curves of the sky above. Emotionally, the painting leaves me with a paradoxical sensation, awe at the vastness of the universe, and at the same time a quiet comfort in the presence of the village and its human scale. The painting seems to ask me to live with both feelings, the immensity that overflows and the intimacy that grounds. So this is the description of what I see, what I actively see when I look at the Starry Night, Van Gogh's Starry Night. And as I hoped I have conveyed to you through this description, the act of gazing imply an active observation that goes beyond the simple act of seeing, the sheer and general act of seeing, because it is an intentional and sustained engagement with the visual element of the painting, of the work, in this case the Starry Night. Whereas a passive observation would stop at the recognition that there is a sky, there is a village, there is a small village, there are the stars. The stars are yellow, the village is dark, and the night, the sky is a dark blue. An active observation, it creates a dialogue with the painting, following the rhythms that are present within the painting itself, following the details, the contrasts that are present in the painting in order to uncover different layers of meaning. So through this type of activity, which I call active observation, the Starry Night becomes less of an image and more of an encounter. We are encountering a presence, and we are trying to give meaning to this type of presence. Of course, this creative dimension of the gaze is not limited to the art, is not limited to the act of looking at painting, a sculpture, a sketch, an image, and so on and so forth. Now, we can think of the act of looking at a friend's face, for instance. A glance at our friend's face can reveal fatigue, can reveal sadness, can reveal joy, can reveal worry. It also, what we notice in our friend's face depends on how we look at their face. And so, for instance, a hurried glance may miss a subtle shadow of sadness beneath a smile. On the contrary, a compassionate and attentive gaze, a careful gaze, might bring it to the forth, might become aware of this shadow of sadness beneath a smile and bring it to the forth. This should make one aspect of the phenomenological understanding of the gaze very clear, and which is that the gaze does not only allow us to perceive things, but it also constitutes the thing that we see. It shapes the reality of what we are seeing by giving meaning to what we're seeing. Nonetheless, because gazing is something intrinsically active, this also means that the gaze is also something personal and subjective. Two people that are looking at the same thing, at the same object, have completely different understanding and interpretations of that same object. I just read to you the description of what I feel when I look at the Starry Night, at the painting, the Starry Night. But you might have a completely different experience when you look at the Starry Night. So different people have different understanding, different interpretations of what they see. And we can also make a different example, an example that I really like because I really like to hike, especially during the summer. So I really need to make this example. But let's use the example of looking at a mountain. So the mountain is one object. Let's pretend that there is a hiker looking at a mountain. A hiker, when they look at the mountain, sees a challenge because the mountain is a challenge for them. The mountain needs to be climbed, so the mountain becomes the symbol for a challenge. On the other hand, a painter who looks at a mountain doesn't see a challenge in the sense that they want to climb that mountain. The painter sees a pattern of lights and shadows, of colors in general. And so they have a completely different understanding of the mountain as an object. But again, we can think of a geologist looking at a mountain. In this case, the geologist will have a different experience from the hiker and from the painter, because what a geologist sees when they see the mountain is layers of time, layers of history, the history of the world in this case. So you see that the mountain is not a single fixed object. It's something that changes. It's shaped, something that is shaped by how people are looking at it. And it becomes what it is through the gaze that is posed upon it. This allows you maybe to better understand how the gaze constitutes the things that are being seen, because they shape it, they transform it, they layer upon it a particular kind of meaning. Now, the subjectivity of the activity of looking at something or someone is not a flow or a distortion of perception. This must be very clear. The fact that our vision and our act of looking is subjective doesn't mean that our vision is distorted or flowed. It is actually the very condition of meaning and of experiencing a meaningful world. This means that without a perspective, without a point of view, without a subjective experience, there would be no lived world. There would only be infinite meaningless data. And if you think about that's the problem with big data today. They're not lived, they don't have a meaning, they're not connected with one another, it's just a flow infinite meaningless data. So to gaze, in the end, is to bring forth a world that is colored with our desires, our intentions, our dreams, and our expectations. And through these desires, expectations, intentions, and so on and so forth, the world can be colored with meaning, can acquire a specific but multi-layered meaning. Okay, before I conclude this last section, before we look at the implications between phenomenology and visual thinking, I want to stress another point, another fundamental point that I haven't stressed so far. Because as of right now, I have elucidated and highlighted how the gaze is something creative and something that produces meaning. However, the act of gazing can also be experienced and can also appear as something that is something that happened to us, something that is imposed upon us, something that we do not want to experience. And in this case, I'm talking about the experience of being seen. So we are reversing our perspective. We are not taking the gaze, we're not taking into consideration, the gaze as something active. We're not taking into consideration the activity of looking at something and producing meaning, but we are taking into consideration the activity of being seen by someone, being judged by someone, and being objectified by the gaze of another person. This experience, this very unique and particular experience, has interested many phenomenologists, but probably the most intense, beautiful, and dramatic description of this experience of being seen by someone else's gaze has been written by Jean-Paul Sartre in his book Being and Nothingness. Here, he describes the experience of being caught in someone else's gaze, and he makes the example of a person peeking through a keyhole and realizing that someone is watching them. In the moment of realization, that is, in that particular moment in which the person who's peeking through the keyhole realizes that there is another person on the other end, there is another person on the other side of the door who's looking at them, this person is no longer a pure subject, but becomes an object in the field of vision of another person. So the idea is that when I realize that someone is watching me, something changes, something shifts. And this fundamental shifts concerns the shift from being a subject to being an object in the visual field of another person. When I experience this shift, when I become aware of being seen by another person, then the way I experience myself transforms, and I start to feel shame, I start to feel vulnerable, I start to feel hyper-conscious of myself. Let me here read a quotation from Sartre, Being and Nothingness. So he writes, "The look of the other person turns my being into an object. It makes me cease to be for myself alone. I become an object for him, and in this objectivity I experience shame." Now, shame is not connected with what I'm doing. That is, it's not that what I'm doing is perceived by me as shameful. That's not the problem. The problem is that in the moment I realize that someone is looking at me, I feel shame. I feel shame because I'm becoming the object of another person. I'm becoming an object at the hands that is at the hands of another person. That's the problem. That's the key fundamental problem that is at play in the mutual act of seeing and being seen. by someone else, of course. I want to say that Simone de Beauvoir, who we have already talked about, tried to extend this insight, connecting the problem of being seen to the patriarchal society and to, in general, social relations. Indeed, in The Second Sex, she explored how women are positioned as the other compared to the male subject in our society, in our patriarchal society. But this is not the only problem. The further problem is, as Beauvoir highlights, is that women are not only seen by men, but they are seen as object for the male gaze. And thus, their experience is constrained, is defined by the male gaze, which sees them as merely object to be stared at, to be looked at. And so you can see here that whereas Sartre focused on the momentary shock that brought the realization that we are being seen by someone else, de Beauvoir highlighted, on the contrary, the persistent and constrained and structured dimension of the gaze. That is, she highlighted the way in which power, social relations, social norms, and identity shape the way in which women experience their body, their consciousness, and their movements within the environment. So we're almost done, I promise you. I want to conclude this section by briefly summarizing what I have said. And so we can conclude by saying that from the phenomenological perspective, the act of gazing then is something far from being passive. It is a deeply structured act of creating meaning, an act that is shaped by our intentions, by our embodiment, by the context and the relations that we are having. So the act of gazing is actually an opening of the self to what is outside of the self, that is the objects that surround the self, others, and the world most generally. And so through the act of gazing, I can pay attention, I can become aware of different aspects of the world, of the objects that are being seen, and of the person who is seeing the world and the objects. And for these reasons, the concept of the gaze, according to phenomenology, forces us to reckon with a central aspect of human existence. We are never fully our own. We are not in a bubble. And so we cannot remain hidden from the eyes of the others. The eyes of the others shape the way we appear, shape the way we see ourselves. And sometimes we feel oppression, sometimes we feel love, sometimes we feel both these feelings. The key point, I think, is to limit the sensation of oppression, to try to eradicate and dismantle the feeling of oppression. So trying to create a balance where the feeling of love has the complete superiority toward the feeling of oppression. So we're on to the last section of this class about the implications between phenomenology and visual thinking. And indeed, in this last part, I want to show you the connection. More concretely, I want to show you the connection between phenomenology and visual thinking. So let me start by saying that the encounter between phenomenology and visual thinking, as the practice of thinking through images by using drawings, by using sketches, by using diagrams or maps to organize and communicate complex ideas, this encounter opens up a new way of understanding and transmitting knowledge. Now, as we know, phenomenology was established by Edmund Husserl during the 20th century, and it's a philosophical method that wants to return to the thing themselves. And as we know right now, going back to the thing themselves means understanding and analyzing phenomena as they appear to us in consciousness without imposing any notions, any assumptions to these same phenomena. Meanwhile, visual thinking has emerged as an educational and communicative tool that translates our different ideas and thoughts into a visual schema, into visual forms such as map, a diagram, a sketch, a drawing, and so on and so forth. Now, when we combine phenomenology and visual thinking, we can see that we can recognize how images are not a simplified representation of a concept. They're not a merely simplification of our process of thinking. Actually, images, they allow us to experience and to translate our lived experience into connecting perceptions, concepts, reflections, and the process of learning itself. More specifically, we know that the starting point of the phenomenological analysis and inquiry is for Husserl, at least, the epoche, as the suspension of judgment about the world, so as to allow phenomena to appear as they truly are. Now, from this perspective, every act of consciousness is intentional. And we know that intentionality means that consciousness is always directed toward an object. Consciousness always has a point of reference or a target. The principle of intentionality is fundamental for phenomenology, but it's also fundamental to reconsider visual thinking, because it has profound implications for a new practice, a more profound, a more insightful practice of visual thinking. Indeed, the images that are drawn in our mind should not be considered as a neutral sign, should not be interpreted as a mechanical and simplified sign, but actually these images that are drawn into our mind are the concretization of an intentional act. They are the visible sign of an experience that occurs both in thought and outside of thought. I hope that you can see here the complexity that is entailed by this process of thinking through images. Images should never be understood as a simplification, should never be understood as the representation of neutral data, as the recreation of neutral data, but they should be understood as something complex, something articulated. It should be understood as an intentional act that actively involves the subject. And so we can say that on the one hand, phenomenology invites us to value the original and pre-reflective experience of seeing, of perception. And on the other hand, visual thinking can be a tool, can stand as a privileged tool for expressing and exploring this privileged dimension of perception and seeing. So visual thinking and phenomenology go hand in hand, because really visual thinking is the more practical part of phenomenology, can be understood as the more practical part of phenomenology, and it allows phenomenology to be put into everyday life. Now, the connection between phenomenology and visual thinking, however, does not end here, because it concerns the phenomena of the body and vision in a more detailed way. As we already know, Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasized the constitutive role of the body for shaping and creating meaning in the phenomenology of perception. In order to show how important the body is in our individual experience, he argued that consciousness is never a matter of a disembodied subject, a detached subject, who is looking at the world that simply stands outside of it, but actually consciousness is a matter of an embodied subject who intertwines with the world through their perceptions, their gestures, their postures, their movements, and so on and so forth. So perception, especially perception, especially in the form of a vision, is not something passive, but it's actually a creative act through which the subject inhabits the world and creates meaningful interactions with the world. This insight about the creativity of the gaze, of the act of seeing something, as we already know, allows us, to have a deeper understanding of what visual thinking is and how it works. Because the gesture of tracing a line, of drawing a line on the page, the organization of space within that page, the choice of different signs and different colors to draw the image, to create, to concretize an image, are not accidental elements. They're actually essential moments within the process of creating a meaning. So every time we transform a concept into an image, we need to recognize that all the more material parts are actually fundamental. They shape the concept in a subjective, personal, and unique way, and they allow that concept to be interpreted in a different way. They allowed the hidden parts, the implicit parts of that concept to come to the fore. And so to draw something literally means to transform and make something bodily within our thoughts. It means to restore our embodied and situated experience, our embodied situated dimension into thought itself. So we can say that when read phenomenologically, visual thinking is a practice that intertwines body and thinking, body and perception, body and reflection. And it intertwines body, reflection, and perception into a circle where seeing and thinking are inseparable. Moreover, representing a concept by using different sort of images can free that concept from the automatism of the verbal language, and therefore it allows us to interrogate that concept in a more original way, we can say, or we can interrogate the concept in its most original form. And in this sense, drawing becomes a tool for deconstructing thought, for deconstructing the mechanism, the habitual mechanism that constitute thinking. And so it allows to reveal what remains hidden, what remains implicit in concepts themselves. You see, there is, in a certain sense, the process of visual thinking is really deeply connected with a process of discovering something new, discovering and creating a new connections between the elements that are already there. Finally, we must draw a connection between visual thinking and phenomenology from the perspective of education, and thus from the perspective of learning. And that's really, really important, because visual thinking, when applied to visual thinking, entails a reversal of the traditional understanding of the process of learning. Learning is usually understood, or was usually understood, as a passive process through which or whereby a student has a passive role and simply has to register in their memories, in their mind, the information that are given to them by the instructor, by the teacher. So students actually don't have to do anything. They just simply have to sit and they just have to register, to collect the informations that are given to them, but they don't have to do anything personal, anything creative with those information. For phenomenology, on the contrary, learning becomes a process through which we have to foster the lived experience of knowing the world, of coming to know the world. So we see here that the student is involved in a completely different process, is involved in a completely different path, a path that unites perception and reflection, body and mind, experience and concept. And this is possible by intertwining phenomenology and visual thinking. So every visual scheme that the student produces, that the student is asked to create, becomes a document that conveys not only the content of learning, not only the content that is being learned, but also the way the content has been learned, the way it has been lived and felt by the student, and the way it has been organized and made meaningful by the students themselves. You see here that the practice of visual thinking, again, when understood phenomenologically, stimulates critical awareness. It stimulates an autonomous interpretation, and it also stimulates the ability to create connections in a unique and creative way. Now, to make this fundamental connection between phenomenology and visual thinking in relation to education, I have two examples for you. I have two exercises that can be done and can really show how visual thinking can stimulate critical awareness and the ability to connect diverse elements in a unique and creative way. So let me begin with the first example, first exercise, which is called blind contour drawing. Now, what is blind contour drawing? Let me describe it to you. We need a group of people that are looking at an everyday object, which can be a book, it can be a mug, it can be a plant, it can be a piece of paper, a table, a chair, whatever. So a group of people is looking at an everyday object, and these people have to look at the object that they chose for 3 minutes. And during those 3 minutes, they have to draw the image, the object on a piece of paper without looking at the page. So they have to draw the object that they picked, but they don't have to look at the page. So looking at how they're drawing the object. The point is that this exercise wants to make us feel the object rather than simply represent the object. This exercise wants to stimulate us to create a lived relationship, a situated relationship with the object in front of our eyes, instead of simply reproduce the object as we should reproduce it, creating thus a beautiful object. And thus, this exercise fosters live, active observation and an embodied interaction with the object that surrounds us. Of course, after having drawn the object, the people that are participating in this activity should discuss what they have, should reflect on what they have drawn, and should also discuss together what they have drawn. This is the first exercise. The second exercise is called conversational drawing, and here people should work in pair. What is this exercise? What does it entail? What does it entail? So first of all, we have people working in pairs, as I told you. So we need two people sitting one in front of another, and we need one person. We need a person who describes the object without naming the object. So there is one person who is describing with words the objects that they have picked, but they're not naming the object itself. And we have another person who is drawing the object without knowing which object they are drawing, simply relying on the words, on the descriptions that the other person is making. At the end, after the drawing is done, the two people should compare the drawing with the real object and see what has come up, what they have come up with. This activity highlights the complexity of mediated perception, that is, of a perception that is not done through our vision, but it's done through the words of another person. But at the same time, this activity highlights the active role that the subjects have in looking at an object, because it shows how a person interprets, selects, and produces meaning and composes an object when describing it. So you see that this activity has really, really important and profound implications. But we're there, we're done. So to conclude this first amazing class on the implications between phenomenology and visual thinking, I want to briefly say that the encounter between phenomenology and visual thinking reveals how images are not a neutral didactic tool, but they're actually authentic devices of thought. They're actually authentic and lived devices that our thought can use to create new meanings, to create a new understanding of the world that surrounds us, making explicit elements that have remained implicit so far. And thus, these images allow us to live original experience and to revalue the embodied and situational dimension of knowledge, thus transforming the process of learning into a phenomenological exercise of active observation. Thank you so much.